When we invest into companies, it's really important to stay up to date with all the news. Now, when you're like me, it's very hard to stay on top when you have 30 plus companies that you invest in. But even so, I try as hard as I can to understand each of the companies and follow the latest news. So today I'm going to be discussing the Apple App Store. There's been concerns regarding the monopoly that Apple has within their marketplace. But before we do, we can see that I have Apple on the screen right now, and the stock price is very high right now. So the company in general is performing well for shareholders. And as a shareholder, we always want to see the company making more and more money. But the question we should ask ourselves is, how are they making that money? And are they alienating any other individuals in the process? So for those who are unaware, DHH is the creator of a programming language called Ruby on Rails, and he's also CTO at a company named Basecamp. Now, he's very well known in the tech community, and some of his recent posts gained more than usual traction, and it's relating to a rejection of an app known as Hey. And Apple has been very forceful and not backing down on their rejection of the app. Now, you can look more into the specific app in question, but from an investor point of view, I have one way of thinking, but as a developer myself, I have a separate way of thinking. So I want to try and marry the two together. And before I continue, I want to just explain that I used to make apps for the Apple App Store, and it wasn't until a few months ago that I decided to stop. And so from a developer perspective, I'm going to be discussing my thoughts, and then as an investor, I'm going to be continuing that thought process. So we have an article by the CNBC, and it's talking about why the Apple App Store is under fire. Now, I'm just going to be talking about how the App Store makes money, and we'll look into this article a little bit more. So to join the Apple Developer Program, you have to pay $99, and for UK residents that equates to £79, and that provides you with membership for the year. So it entitles you to create applications for iOS, and then Apple will host your applications and they deal with the distribution side as well. So when you go onto the App Store and you search for a given app, Apple has its own way of ranking those apps, and if your app is successful, then it will be ranked higher and potentially promoted on the homepage. Now, paying a fee every year is a deterrent for other developers, and so while Apple makes money from the process, it also filters out applications that are not fully up to scratch, because a lower than average developer is less likely to go through the hurdle of paying a yearly fee to then build a rubbish app. Now, from a developer's perspective, there's more hurdles along the way, and every time you update your application, there is a manual review process. Now, on top of that, Apple takes a 30% cut from digital purchases. So if I list my app as $1 on the App Store, and for argument's sake, let's just say that's £1, then Apple takes a 30% cut on every download. So that $1 equates to 70 cents. Now, for a developer, the costs do not stop there. If you're working a full 9 to 5 job on top, then any additional income is taxed. So for those in the UK, you have to disclose this to HMRC. And so depending on which tax bracket you are in, you're subject to 20 or 40% taxation on top. So that 70 cents, or let's just say 70 pence, if you're taxed at a 20% rate, then you are left with 56 pence. And so very quickly you can see how you're left with just slightly over half the listing price. Now, for the most part, developers have accepted this process. Developers are aware that they have access to a whole range of consumers, and so that is the trade-off that takes place. Now, it's not to say that the percentages that Apple take are not fair. I would say up until this point, even the 30% is a bit greedy, but given it's a smaller marketplace of developers, the number is going to be higher to that of other companies, for instance. Now, this article does actually reference David Hanson, and that is the creator of Ruby on Rails, as I mentioned mentioned earlier. Now, the debate has started because Apple is now requesting that applications that deal with subscriptions have to go through Apple's subscription services. And in the event that that happens, Apple then takes a cut, and it ranges from 15 to 30%. And so you can see how frustrating this is from a developer. As I mentioned earlier, you receive just over half when you factor all the money that Apple takes in the taxation. But in terms of any subscription-based services within the application, you are then subjected to an additional 15 to 30%. Now, it's obvious if there were more app stores in play, then these types of situations wouldn't happen. At the moment, we have the Android store, and we can talk about situations on the Play Store in a future video, but all we really have is the App Store and the Play Store, and they operate as a duopoly. And on top of that, you have patents that prevent other companies from creating a similar style app store. And so it's very difficult for any new type of application to grow and compete with the likes of the App Store. Now, from an investor's point of view, it's very easy to think, well, okay, if there's more apps that have subscriptions, then there's more money and more proceeds that end up in the form of dividends for us investors, and also attributes to the increase in the stock price. And that is true. And so, for instance, if Apple was to remove or reduce this subscription fee, then Apple's revenue would decrease. But this type of thinking isn't actually sustainable. There's a lot of developers that are frustrated that they're having to use Apple's services for them to then take additional revenue. And it's really highlighted on the subscription part of Apple. And so, for instance, we have companies like Stripe, which allow for a different payment gateway, and you can charge customers using Stripe services. But Apple is pretty much forcing individuals to use their implementation and their services, but then take a really high cut from the proceeds. So as an investor, we need to care about this as well. Even if you are not a developer, as an investor, we really have to care about these situations, because the developers are the key to the App Store. If there's less developers and there's less apps, then there's less money that Apple makes from the app side of their service. So if I had any power whatsoever, to resolve this issue, I would like to see Apple remove the need to have subscriptions running through their service and instead open up the ability to use different payment gateways. That really would solve the heart of the problem in hand. Now, my honest opinion is that the $99 fee should actually be more than enough to cover the costs, and they can potentially have a 10 to 15% cut within the downloads of the app. Now, I doubt very much Apple will ever change that 30%, given that Apple has had this 30% take for as long as I can remember. Now, right now, Apple isn't backing down, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And so that's all we can comment on for the time being. So let me know what you think about Apple in general. And with that said, I'll catch you in the next one.